Today's LiveOnWeb program, the ELD Landscape Ahead, is brought to you by PeopleNet and Protective Insurance.
Hello and welcome to today's LiveOnWeb program, the ELD Landscape Ahead. I'm Seth Clevenger, Managing Editor of Features at Transport Topics. The start date for the federal government's mandate of electronic logging devices, now less than 4 months away, will soon change the business landscape in trucking and will likely create ripple effects across the supply chain. Under this regulation, most interstate motor carriers have until December 18th to make the transition from paper logbooks to electronic driver logs. Industry executives and analysts generally expect ELDs to improve compliance with driver hours of service limits across the trucking industry and put carriers on a more level playing field. At the same time, many expect the ELD rollout to reduce freight hauling capacity as enforcement tightens. But there's also an opportunity for carriers to use this technology to improve efficiency. During this episode of LiveOnWeb, we'll examine all of these facets of the mandate to help ensure that your company is prepared for the ELD era. Today's program is sponsored by PeopleNet and Protective Insurance. Joining us here in the studio to help answer your questions about ELDs is Joe DeLorenzo, Director of FMCSA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance. For those of you who don't already know him, Joe has really been a leading voice on ELDs, and he's been speaking about the mandate at numerous industry events and answering a ton of questions, including some of my own, so we're really pleased to have him with us today. Later on, we'll hear from Russ Elliott, Senior Vice President of Operations at Melton Truck Lines, a flatbed carrier based in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I recently spoke with Russ about his company's experiences with electronic logs, its plans to transition from AOBRDs to ELDs, and his expectations on how ELDs will affect the industry in the months ahead and beyond. We'll also hear from Tom Paduch, Director of Logistics Design at Tran Service, a provider of full-service truck leasing, as well as a dedicated carrier and logistics provider. Tom will explain how his company is using onboard technology and share his advice to first-time adopters of electronic logs. Now, as we get into this discussion, we also invite you to participate in today's program. You can email your questions or comments to share@ttnews.com, or if you're watching on the web, you can comment directly on this page. And if you're watching via Facebook Live, simply enter your question in the comment box. To begin, let's address one of the most common questions I hear about the ELD mandate: how it will be enforced. So Joe, if you could help us out, maybe just start off by giving us an overview of how the mandate will be enforced come December 18th.
Sure, Seth, and before I start, just thanks, I appreciate you guys having me and have the opportunity to help you guys answer some of the questions that you have. I think before we talk about enforcement, it's important to remember exactly what happens on December 18th. On December 18th, the main change in the industry is going to be the elimination of paper logbooks. So at that time, we're going to see a mix of different technologies. We're going to see carriers that are going to be compliant with the ELD mandate, but we're also going to see carriers that are going to be continuing to use their grandfathered devices that meet today's specs, which we'll call AOBRDs here today. Sure. So that's going to be the landscape when we get there on December 18th. So from an enforcement perspective, I think the second point I always like to make is, and you made this in your introductory remarks, that this is about hours of service compliance. So we're working with our state partners and with our federal staff across the country to make sure that everybody is ready to enforce hours of service come that date. My expectation when we come December 18th is that everybody that's required to have either one of those two types of compliant devices has one at that time, and that regulation will be enforced. So if a carrier that is required to have ELD or a grandfathered device at that point in time is stopped after that date, they can expect that they would be cited by that officer on the roadside, and they could possibly be subject to either to penalties towards the driver or from the carrier. The second question that always comes up is, you know, my truck is there and it doesn't have an ELD and I get a ticket or whatever the case may be. What happens now? So we are currently having some discussions with our state partners and with the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance as to how we would handle enforcing the out-of-service violation, meaning the truck would be parked until such time as that violation was corrected after that date. With this rule, like others, we understand that there is going to be some adjustment period with carriers and drivers learning how to use their devices, as well as with folks, you know, making sure that they're fully in compliance. So we are having some discussions with CVSA and considering that perhaps we may have a softer rollout of the out-of-service violation. But the number one point that I want to make with everyone, and even after we make this decision, is that the rule is going to be enforced from the very beginning. Our expectation is that everyone is compliant, and we're going to work towards that over the next few months to do everything we can.
Okay. So, of course, this rule was finalized back in late 2015, so this hasn't been a secret, and there won't be a grace period after December 18th.
That's correct.
Okay. But as far as out-of-service violations, there are some factors, and you guys are looking at that with enforcement on the best way to handle that, at least in the early days. Is that fair to say?
That's fair, absolutely.
Okay. And you know, before we go further, I think it's you know, a good idea to talk about the status of the rule itself. You know, there have been court challenges, and the rule has withstood those. You know, the Supreme Court declined to hear a challenge to the rule, so the court cases have been settled. There has been some legislative action. Representative Babin of Texas has introduced legislation that would delay the mandate, implementation of the mandate by 2 years. You know, our take on it is, while it has some support, it doesn't have the support needed to move through from congressional leaders. What's your take on that, and do you see this having an effect on the December 18th implementation date?
Well, I think kind of back to our earlier discussion, in the first question we had was, I would urge people not to procrastinate in anticipation of something that may or may not happen. The agency's perspective at this time is that the rule is going to go into effect as planned as December 18th, and we're just going to do everything we can working with the industry and with everyone to make sure that they're prepared.
Okay. And then, you know, kind of talking a little bit more about how the rule will be enforced. We talked about the roadside scenario. At what point would, I guess, violations, fines for not having an ELD lead to an audit by DOT?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. It's one I get asked a fair amount. And I think the important thing to keep in mind with this ELD rule is it really doesn't change any of our other processes. One thing that we hope it does is reduce the amount of hours of service violations that the carriers have. But our investigative process, a lot of the folks probably watching are familiar. We have a prioritization system called the Safety Measurement System, and part of that system looks at a carrier's hours of service violations, and these ELD violations would fall into that category. So if it came to our attention through looking at at carriers' data that there seemed to be a problem, then that carrier could be flagged for some type of intervention, being it a simple warning letter or something up to or and including an investigation.
Okay. And we did get a good question here from Mike Kelly of YRC Worldwide, and he's asking what compliance will look like for the first few months, and beyond that, he points out that there are, you know, at least 50 different enforcement authorities, you know, 50 different states. Will there be a patchwork of different approaches to ELD enforcement, or will there be a uniform, coordinated approach?
Sure. It's a great question. And again, not necessarily unique to ELDs, but in this case, with a major new rollout, we work really closely with the states through our division offices, as well as with the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, the organization that its primary purpose is to establish uniformity and enforcement of these rules across the states. So on a rule like this one, we really anticipate that we're going to have good uniform enforcement. We've been working with the states. As you mentioned earlier, the rule's been out for 18 months. We've been working with everyone on enforcement and policy and training from the very beginning. So we're going to continue that process and try and make the rollout as smooth as possible for everyone. But as we mentioned earlier, with any major rollout, we always do need to be sensitive to the fact that there's going to be some level of confusion on the part of drivers and their vehicles and companies, and working with enforcement to keep those things to a minimum and make enforcement as uniform as we can.
Okay, and maybe on the other side of that coin with enforcement, do you think that the enforcement side is ready? Given the complexity of the many things that a roadside inspection might yield, that an officer might see, in the truck, in the cab of a truck, whether it be an AOBRD or one of many different types of ELD systems. Do you think that the enforcement side is going to be ready come December?
Yeah, I do think that they'll be ready. I think that, as we talked about earlier, and you mentioned now that there's going to be, several different devices. But one of the things that I hope and I expect happens actually in December is that to some degree the complexity on the roadside is going to be reduced. Because right now in today's world, the roadside officer could run across a paper log, some sort of electronic software app that's recording hours of service, or an AOBRD or ELD today. Come December, I think that complexity goes down significantly. We get down to just the AOBRDs and ELDs, the electronic devices. I think come December 2019, when we're fully ELD, it gets even easier. But we have a strong plan, and we work closely with the states on training, where we're going to do some training coming up this fall, again after the training that we've already done, and then continue that through the spring, as you mentioned in the question that came in earlier from YRC. This going through the beginning of next year and into the spring, the transition's still going to be going on. So we're going to continue to work on our training and keep everybody going forward at that point.
Okay, and we got another question from Rick Sumser at General Transport, Inc. And he points out that there are going to be many small carriers that he thinks will be late to install equipment, and the drivers, of course, will need to learn how to operate them properly. He asks, will this be an out-of-service violation during a roadside inspection? We touched on that a little bit already, but it would be good to recap. And how will the DOT follow up to make sure an ELD is properly installed and the driver's trained on how to use it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a good opportunity to talk. The question here, really gets to the issue of how important training the drivers is. So I think folks that are in the process of making that switch over now really should be aware that it is going to be a change in philosophy and a change in operation, and they want to be able to explain that at the roadside. As you said, I think we talked about enforcement a little bit earlier, but sure, we understand that it's going to take the industry some time to adjust to this completely new way, for some people anyway, for some of the carriers, completely new way of recording their hours of service. So, we're going to do what we can to work with folks as we move into the implementation timeframes.
Okay, and kind of going back to the complexity of this, the potential complexity with different devices. Last I checked, there were more than 90 vendor-certified devices on FMCSA's registry, so there's a lot of different systems out there. And to your point earlier, fleets will still be running grandfathered AOBRDs, the systems that are out on the road now, for the most part. Now, what can carriers do to make that process go smoothly at roadside? Is there something that fleets can tell their drivers, that drivers can do themselves to make sure that they're prepared for enforcement?
Sure, I think there's a lot that they can do, and one of the nice things, particularly about when you get into the ELD specifications and those particular devices, is as many different devices as are out there, they're all standardized. They're operating under the same specification. Sure. They have kind of standard output. But back a little bit to our earlier conversation, I really urge the carriers to make sure that they are taking the time to train not only their drivers, but also whatever support personnel they have involved in the process. I always like to point this out that the roadside inspection process is a difficult process for both the driver and the officer that's inspecting them. It's trying to deal with all of the issues and get hours of service information at the roadside. The better informed that a driver is, the better that process will go. The rule actually requires that the driver have a copy of the manual for the device in their vehicle, as well as instructions about how to enact data transfer, which I think we'll probably talk about a little bit more. The more familiar the drivers are with that process, the better it will go. And in the beginning, I think because we probably won't see as many devices, or the interactions won't be as often until we see, full implementation, remembering for the drivers that they may need to be reminded of that process now and again, and as part of your regular driver training programs, to keep that at the forefront of their mind. So when they get stopped either by a federal or state official, they can say, this is the type of device I have, here's how it works, I've got my instruction sheet. Can't emphasize training on the carrier's part more than I don't think you can emphasize it anymore. It's really going to be the core of this for the carrier side.
Yeah, and if you try to do that, a day before the mandate, could be a challenge, right? I mean, that seems like something that should be done well in advance.
The sooner you get started on it, I think the better. Just like it's really no different than any other change that a company is making to their policies and their procedures.
Sure. And you did mention data transfer, so we'll hit that next. Now, compliant ELDs will need some type of electronic data transfer method, and that could be web services, it could be USB 2.0 or Bluetooth, and then there's some backup methods, either handing a display out to the out of the window to the officer, or even a printout. But it sounds like FMCSA is targeting web service as kind of the premier, most predominant way of transferring this information. What's the status of that web services transfer system, and do you expect to have that ready by the time the rule goes into effect in December?
Sure, yeah, we absolutely do, and I think you're right. It really seems to be that the industry preference, the vendor community, seems to be leaning towards the telematics options, either web services or the email transfer of that file. I think it fits more naturally with the way the carriers are doing business these days anyway. But yeah, so we've been working hard on establishing how that process is going to work and developing the software. We're planning on having an initial run of that process this fall, September or October, so we have time to do some real good, we talked about training of the enforcement folks, be able to do that in the October and November timeframe leading up to December, and then continuing to follow up on it as we move through into next year.
Okay. And then another question on the different ELDs. These devices are self-certified by the vendors, the companies that are supplying the devices. So there's a chance that at some point some could be challenged as non-compliant, some could be found to be non-compliant. Can you take us through FMCSA's process for reviewing and potentially I guess revoking a certification or bringing a device up to speed if there's a problem?
Sure, yes, it's not like this is the first time I've gotten that question.
Right.
So a couple of things I think happening is, everybody's a little bit concerned, brings up this issue that the devices are self-certified, so they don't know exactly what's going to happen. There's a few things that happen there that I think that everybody needs to be aware of that I think can help. One is we do an initial screen of their application, make sure that they provide all the information that's required, and as the rule says, like any other type of technology or device, we rely on the manufacturer to certify that. But I believe that if we run across one of those situations, most of what we're seeing right now that could be potential problems are going to be maybe issues with software that can be corrected fairly easily through an over-the-air fix. But in the event that we found something that was more widespread, we would certainly be working with not only the vendor but any carrier so that we could figure out what needed to be done in order to have the fixes taken care of and not interrupt the carrier's operations. Keeping in mind what we talked about at the very beginning, which is this is about hours of service compliance. So if the device is accurately recording that, we'll work with folks. But we anticipate that if we do find issues, they should be fairly easily corrected. I'd also just like to take a second to mention, too, that we put a tool on our website that was initially designed for the vendors in order to test their output files, so they can put their files in, submit them to us. They get run through the technology process to make sure that they're compliant. And I think that that, as well as any other questions that carriers have about how the vendor established compliance, should be discussed in that process of choosing a vendor. So these are the kind of questions. We have a checklist on our website that says, carriers, these are the things you should be asking your vendor. Have you checked your output file is another good one kind of to add to that. And what have you done to certify compliance? So, you know, along with training of the drivers, once you've selected your device before that, is what are the conversations you're having with the vendor to make sure that they have done what they need to do, so we don't even have to really get to the issue that you brought up in your question.
Okay, great. And just as a reminder to our viewers, you're watching LiveOnWeb's look at the ELD Landscape Ahead, and we invite your participation in the show. You can email your questions or comments to share@ttnews.com or comment directly on this webpage. And if you're watching via Facebook Live, simply enter your question in the comment box. So as we alluded to earlier, the ELD rule does include a 2-year grandfather clause for the systems, electronic logging systems out there that we're referring to as AOBRDs, which stands for Automatic Onboard Recording Devices. It gets a little technical there, but essentially if you've been running e-logs for a number of years and you already are using a system, you're probably using an AOBRD. And if you fall into that category, you have until December of 2019, 2 extra years to comply with the full specifications of the ELD rule. Based on what we hear, some fleets are making that transition quickly. Some are choosing to let the dust settle for a while and take advantage of that grandfather clause. One factor that, you know, often is a determining factor for that decision is whether or not you expect your fleet size to grow in the coming 2 years. And correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but it's my understanding that you can move your existing AOBRD devices into a new truck if it's a replacement truck. But once you start expanding the size of your fleet through additions, at that point you will need ELDs post-December of this year.
That's absolutely correct. The way it's always hard with the grandfather provision. You have to kind of draw the line somewhere. And the way that the rule reads is that if the device was installed and in use prior to December of this year, then you can continue to use that device. So you're exactly correct. If you are retiring that truck and you want to take that device out and put it in a new one, that's okay. But if you're adding capacity, any new devices that are purchased would have to be ELD compliant.
Okay. And I recently spoke to Russ Elliott, who's the Senior Vice President of Operation at Melton Truck Lines, about his company's use of e-logs and their plans for moving from AOBRD to ELD. So let's go ahead and play that clip. So Russ, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time. First off, can you tell me a little bit about Melton's experiences with electronic driver logs? You know, how long have you been on e-logs? How has it affected hours of service compliance and back office planning and productivity?
Well, hello, Seth, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Melton has been on the platform about 10 years. We made the jump early on. We knew at some point that it was coming. We didn't know exactly when, but we took the plunge, like I say, about 10 years ago. And it has been a pleasant experience for us. There's really been nothing unpleasant about it. And I will say, just quite simply and to the point, from an operations standpoint, it has made life much easier. Having visibility of all the driver available hours has certainly made planning very easy. So our back office has been fine. Obviously, there are learning curves. We'll go through some of that here in a little bit, but it's been fine for us. It hasn't been a real problem.
Okay. And really quickly, what would be some of your advice to the folks in the industry who are going through this for the first time or will be in the coming months? You guys have had some experience, but what would be your advice to the first-time adopters of e-logs out there?
Well, for the first-time folks, I think it's important to just take a step back and make sure that your house is completely in order. You have to be a compliant carrier, whether you're on paper logs or you're on electronic platform, it doesn't matter. But you've got to make sure that you're compliant, your house is in order, and that everything is going fine on your end. If all of those things are going well for you, then you're not going to have near the problems. You hear a lot of carriers talking about a massive loss in productivity when they change over, but that's probably because they're not running correctly. And they're allowing some things to go on in the paper environment that won't go on in the electronic environment. So we actually, when we converted 10 years ago, we actually had a slight increase in our overall productivity, which you didn't hear a lot of. It was about 1%. So it was almost nothing across the board from the standpoint. There certainly wasn't a huge decrease of any kind.
Okay. And how about your drivers? Did, going back 10 years or so, how did they take to e-logs when you made that transition?
Well, of course, with any change. I mean, I even remember back 20 years ago when we went to the a satellite platform. You know, there's always the conspiracy theories and the pushback and everything, but it wasn't tremendous. It's how you sell the program to your fleet, and if you sell it properly, and you let them know that you're doing it with their best interest in mind, then it goes over much better. Don't treat anything like a jam down.
Yeah. Okay. And then for the folks in the industry who have been using e-logs for a number of years, yourselves included in that, the ELD rule does include a grandfather clause for existing devices, generally categorized as AOBRDs, automatic onboard recording devices.
Correct.
So there's 2 extra years to comply with the technical specifications in the ELD rule. So there are, the question about, how fleets are going to make that transition from AOBRD to ELD. Some I hear are planning to make that switch pretty soon. Others plan to wait, most, if not all, of the 2 years and kind of let the dust settle. What's your perspective at Melton? What are your plans for moving from the AOBRD to the full ELD spec?
Well, Seth, early on, when we first started looking at it early this year, we thought we would probably be one of the carriers. We would just take the plunge right away and go straight into the ELD mandate. But since we've taken a little bit more of a look at it, and there are certainly no negatives involved other than just getting used to a couple of the different rule changes, I think we're going to probably grandfather. And I don't know if we're going to grandfather for the complete time. We do have plans to grow our fleet over the next 2 years. And doing so, then any new trucks that are added, net gains that come on, will go on to the ELD platform. And we've talked about that internally, whether it's viable to have trucks on 2 different platforms. We don't think it's going to be any problem if we do. And our feeling is it will give us a little bit more time to really ease into it and study the changes a little bit instead of just going all in.
Okay. And then you alluded to just kind of like the slightly different rule sets. What are the aspects of the ELD rule and ELDs that are a little bit different from AOBRDs that you're referring to?
Right. Well, the main one is the yard move. When they start talking about, any movement of the truck is going to start the driver's 14-hour clock. And so that's a little bit different in the yard move. And then maintenance personnel as well. If you're moving the truck, if maintenance personnel are moving the truck, you're going to have a way that they can code into the system, because you don't want to start the driver hours there. And then the entire, personal conveyance, that's a big one that's being talked about. And so that's a little bit different as well.
All right, welcome back. And Joe, I want to see if you had anything to add on the main operational differences between an AOBRD and an ELD. We hear about things like accounting for yard moves, drivers being required to approve edits to their logs. What are some of maybe you can go into a little bit of detail on how the ELD environment is a little bit different from the AOBRD environment?
Sure, and I think you heard a little bit of that in the video, and I think the point that I got out of watching that is you really need to know your operation and figure out exactly how this is going to fit in with all of what you do. I think the biggest change is what you mentioned, is that now the ELD is recording all of the miles that happens on that vehicle. And so what that means is, as a company, it didn't change any of the rules before. It didn't change how you account for that yard move time in terms of their hours, or how you account for any of these other issues that have come up. It just means that because there is this electronic accounting now, and the rule requires the company to be able to explain all of those miles, that supporting company policy is really going to be the key to that whole thing. So, if you have these yard move issues, how are you handling this? and how are you managing the process in your office of having those hours assigned. And you mentioned the issue of driver edits and annotations. I think I can't stress that issue enough in terms of its importance to the carrier's operations because of these movements that maybe weren't accounted for on paper because you didn't have to put them down and they are all there now. Having that loop within your company of supervisor looking at those hours, or even if you're just a small company and managing it and the driver, and having that circle through to the driver to account for those hours, I think is really one of the key differences here in the ELD environment. And as much as it's technology and an ELD issue, it's an issue of, have you thought about this in your company and exactly how this is going to work and how you're going to manage that process?
Okay. Another topic we sometimes hear come up with the move to ELDs is personal conveyance. Drivers using the trucks to, say, go home just to move themselves, not freight for the company. And I know FMCSA is working on guidance for that, right, to help spell that out more clearly.
Sure. We actually have guidance that's out there already that I think folks should take a look at. And we're just, one of the things we've seen with the ELD rule is that a lot of questions that are not ELD questions are raised by the fact that
Right.
this accounting of miles is there all of the time. So things like personal conveyance, where you just didn't really have to address it in the paper environment. Now those miles are getting recorded and you have to be able to manage it. And again, with personal conveyance, I think it comes down to the same things in that what's your company policy about personal conveyance? Personal conveyance is not a requirement. It's not a requirement that a company allow a driver to use their vehicle for personal conveyance, but they should have a process and a procedure for how they manage those moves, if they, when they allow it and how they manage it.
Okay. And next I'd like to address maybe the broader industry implications of the ELD mandate. So at the end of the day, I've been saying that the mandate really could be a business opportunity for ELD compliant fleets, but it's also obviously a likely roadblock for those who stall or do not comply. At the same time, we hear many in the industry projecting reduction in freight hauling capacity. Kind of the baseline projection we hear from some observers is perhaps in the 3 to 5% range as a result of the regulation. And Joe, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I mean, do you have any thoughts on this expectation that freight capacity in general across the industry could tighten as a result of ELDs and tighter enforcement of hours of service?
Yeah, there's not a whole lot I can say about that other than to really point out a couple things, and you touched on this already, and that is that the ELD rule didn't change the hours of service rules in any way. So the available hours that were there before are there now. I do think that some fleets will find that once they have implemented the technology, they will see some efficiency gains. So I think it just a little bit remains to be seen on exactly how this happens as we go through rollout.
Okay. And then we're also hearing anecdotally that some shippers are looking at this closely, and they're connecting with their carriers to make sure that they have a plan for ELDs. Will you be compliant? And are looking to secure agreements with compliant carriers ahead of the deadline to make sure that their freight's moving legally in a compliant way. So perhaps shippers could end up playing a role in moving this mandate through in a way and making it, moving the industry toward compliance with it. And on the other side, there's also insurance providers, equipment finance providers. I suspect that they'll want to work with carriers who they know are ELD compliant and might not be subject to this kind of enforcement. So Joe, do you see shippers and say insurance providers also kind of playing a role in this ecosystem in the move toward
Yeah,
ELDs?
I sure do, and I think they do today, and I think they will continue to do that. We point this out all the time, that any government regulation is really the minimum standard. And if our goal at FMCSA is to, improve the safety of the transportation environment, and I think that's everybody's kind of goal while, being able to move the freight, that we need to move. And I think it takes everybody it takes the shipper community and the carrier community, as well as the insurance providers and others, to maximize the safety that we can get.
Okay. And Russ Elliott of Melton also had some interesting comments about how ELDs will likely change the industry. So let's go ahead and hear what he had to say.
I guess you see a benefit to letting some of the kinks be worked out as well when come December 18th. Much of the industry is making this transition, and perhaps you can learn from their experiences.
Yes, absolutely. And most of my peers that I have spoken with that are on the AOBRD platform probably are going to exercise the grandfather clause. There are a few that are not, but I think everybody's going to take more of the ease-in approach into it rather than going hardline. Now, folks that aren't already installed, they're going to go straight up on the ELD.
Right. Got it. And we've been talking about ELDs and the ELD mandate for years now. It's been a topic of discussion throughout the industry, and we're now finally, we have a final rule, and we're getting close to the implementation date. We're now just about 4 months away from that December 18th deadline. So I want to get your thoughts now that we're almost there. How do you expect the industry as a whole to change come December?
Well, Seth, there's been, like you say, a lot of talk, and to this point, it's all speculation. No one really knows. Everyone's tossing around numbers that there's going to be a 3 to 5% loss of capacity. I don't know if it's going to be 2% or 20%. No one really knows till we get in. I don't think it's going to be as big of an impact, possibly, as some have said, but there will be some impact. And from our standpoint, we're ready. We've been getting ready for 10 years, if you will. So it's not going to change our lives when December 18th rolls around.
Okay. And I was wondering if you're hearing anything, perhaps from some of your shipper customers, who I hear anecdotally are starting to look at this and want to be proactive and make sure that their carriers are prepared for this and are running legally and ELD compliant when the mandate goes into effect. Are you hearing any of your shippers who are asking about that? Do you think that that's on their radar?
What's interesting, Seth, is there are a few that have actually reached out to us. We've been pretty proactive with our customer base, letting them know where we stand. We try to get out ahead of things a little bit, not keep anybody guessing. But some of the larger shippers that we have, larger customers, have actually reached out and have asked some very direct questions. And I think they're doing that, and they're smart for doing that, to make sure that their carriers are going to be properly lined up, because they don't want any big surprises, obviously, in December if they have been using someone that's not on the platform or can't get there fast enough. So we're starting to hear more and more of that going on out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And, I've made the argument that, and depending on who you are and if you're prepared and you're already using electronic logs, the mandate in many ways can be an opportunity, especially if there is some tightening of capacity. Perhaps some additional business goes the way of, some fleets that are, have been out there a long time, have a good reputation, and, are fully compliant. Do you see it in the same way?
Well, I certainly have not looked at it from a negative standpoint. And, and once again, who knows what's going to happen if the economy, the economy this year in 17 has been certainly better than 16, at least in our world, in the flatbed business. It's been far better. And if the projections go into 18, if the economy continues to improve, then there's going to be a created capacity issue, especially over in flatbed, most likely anyway. And so trying to guess how much of that's going to be ELD cost and how much of it's just the economy increasing, I'll leave that up for the economists to figure out. But we're looking at it very positively, and there's nothing that you just said that's not true. I do anticipate there may be some guys that drop out, and whether it's the sectors that our customers are in, I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see how it's going to go. You bet. It's been planned for years, and it's kind of interesting that it seems that some people have thought that it was going to go away, and they kept thinking. I know within the last month there was a bill that was introduced into the House of Representatives that it didn't make it into committee, so it's not going anywhere. And there have been several attempts, but I think barring a last minute, something coming from maybe even as high as the White House, it'd have to come almost out of there to stop it. I think it's going. And so everybody needs to be prepared. It's coming.
Yeah, and it's just kind of looking at hours of service compliance in general. Perhaps we could quickly touch on that. In the concept that the ELDs will help level the playing field for hours of service compliance. Is that something that you do believe will make a real difference, and is it something you're looking forward to?
Absolutely. Since we made the decision 10 years ago to install the electronic logs, we have been firmly behind it and believe that everybody should be on this platform. And it's the rule, and that's what everybody needs. Everybody needs to play by the same set of rules. And it promotes safety as well.
All right, welcome back. And thanks again to Russ for taking the time to chat with us about electronic logs. And before we go further, I want to hit some of your questions that have been coming in. I have a question from Avery Weiss, and he's asking about one of the exemptions available through the rule. His question is, how will roadside enforcement be able to determine whether or not a driver truly qualifies for the exemption available for those drivers who only need to maintain rods no more than 8 days out of a 30-day period? How's enforcement going to know whether or not that's the case?
Sure. I mean, it's a good question, and it's really I like to remind people we have some of these same situations today. We have the 100 air mile radius exemption. Driver's not required to maintain any documentation, pulls into the weigh station to get an inspection, explains, I'm a 100 air mile radius driver. A lot of times they'll know them, but that's the only explanation that's required. In those cases, if there is some issue that comes up, sometimes those things would get referred over, and we would kind of check back with the company, either the state or the federal staff at that point in time. This 8 and 30 rule is really the same thing. Mm-hmm. My recommendation to folks, kind of going back to some of the stuff we talked about with ELD, is the better the driver can articulate that exemption, the better off they'll be. They can say, hey, you know what? This is normally I run this 100 air mile radius, but I run this route twice a month or whatever the case happens to be, and they can articulate it to the officer. So, the only time there would be any kind of issue if there was some real kind of question that came up in the officer's mind about that exemption. But a lot of that is on us, and we're working really hard to make sure that in our training with the states we articulate that to them. And then, of course, that the carrier maintains the records and the documentation of that back at their place of business if anyone were to ask.
Okay. And we've also gotten a few questions in. One of the topics that always comes up when we talk about ELDs is short-term rental trucks. Can you take us through what that environment's going to look like? These short-term rental trucks, maybe a fleet has a truck that's down in the shop and they need a truck temporarily, but that driver still needs an ELD. How is that going to work in practice come December 18th?
Sure, yeah, we've gotten a lot of questions about that. And just to take one step back, one of the important things to remember about the ELD rule, we talked earlier about it being about hours of service compliance, is that there's not necessarily interoperability required between devices. So if a driver's an ELD compliant device and is in a rental truck, for that particular trip while they're operating, they need two things. They need to be operating with an ELD, and they need to have their previous 7 days of records of duty status. How they do that is really up to them. In a case like that, when there's any kind of issue with the ELD, they could print out the logs for those previous 7 days and have them with them, or they could have an electronic copy of those logs, as long as at the time of their inspection they're compliant and they have their current day on an ELD if they need to, and they have the previous 7 days, then everything will be okay.
Yeah, and I'll add to that your lease rental providers may be looking at ways to help you with that as well. We're starting to hear some of them think about ways they can help their customers comply with the mandate. So that may be something to ask them about as well moving forward. Now, kind of going back to one of the potential pitfalls, I think, with the mandate is that too many carriers might wait until the very end to comply, wait until the final weeks or days to figure this all out. And there are a couple elements to that. I mean, I've heard at least some concern that the ELD vendors might run low on supplies, the actual devices that will be needed. And there's also the training element for drivers, and if you're a fleet of any size, for the back office and learning how to use it. Just having the device doesn't necessarily mean you're ready. Joe, do you think that that's a real concern?
I'm more concerned about the last part of your question. I think, as you mentioned earlier, there's somewhere in the range of 80 or 90 different providers now on our website, and I'm sure there's probably more to come. I think as the technology has changed and we're starting to see bring your own device solutions that are compliant with ELD, I think I'm less concerned about supply and capacity there. I am concerned, and we spend a lot of time and are doing a lot of outreach to drivers and carriers now to get them moving, because as we mentioned earlier, the training component and understanding your device, really it only benefits the carrier to have that really squared away before December 18th, and they have to go out and go through an inspection with that device. So all we can do is just keep trying to work and put as much material out there for folks as we possibly can.
Okay. And another point I'd like to make is that ELDs don't have to be viewed as a burden. There's also an opportunity here to improve the efficiency of your operations. Even if you're not going with all the bells and whistles, I mean, there's just eliminating the manual paperwork associated with keeping a paper driver log is something you can take out of the driver's workload. And of course, there are many of these systems that go far beyond that and offer applications that can streamline tasks like driver vehicle inspection reports, IFTA mileage for fuel taxes, tracking miles per gallon, driver performance, engine metrics, onboard navigation, on and on. So I recently spoke with Tom Paduch at Tran Service at the TMW PeopleNet Insight Conference earlier this month in Nashville, and he talked about some of the things that they're doing at Tran Service. So let's go ahead and play that clip and hear what he had to say.
Hello, I'm Seth Clevenger, Managing Editor of Features at Transport Topics, here at the TMW PeopleNet Insight User Conference in Nashville. Joined with me here today is Tom Paduch. He's the Director of Logistics Design at Tran Service, a provider of full-service lease, dedicated carriage, and logistics. Mm-hmm. And Tom, if you could go ahead and take us through your experiences with electronic logs at Tran Service. When did you guys implement, and what's your experience been like thus far?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Tran Service, we've had the benefit of a lot of our customers demanding a lot of current modern technology from us. So they've been, maybe some people say they've been pushing us along or pulling us along, right. but they've been forcing us to use different technologies over time. So we've been using, we call them onboard computers, some people call them ELDs and everything in between, but we've been using them for about 7 to 9 years for different purposes.
Sure, and there are lots of different types of electronic logging systems on the market, anything ranging from full-featured fleet management system really that has many different applications in addition to electronic logs. There's also a lot of new vendors on the market ahead, that have appeared ahead of the mandate with more basic systems, maybe just focused on ELD compliance only, or ELD compliance with maybe 1 or 2 added features. So lots of different approaches that fleets could take with this when they're looking to adopt a system ahead of the deadline. But maybe you can give me an example of some of the ways that Tran Service is using its onboard technology beyond electronic logs. What are some of the other features you guys are taking advantage of?
Sure, absolutely. Like you said, it's a very wide space. There's a lot of options and different opportunities out there. But we're really embracing it as a do-all device for our drivers. So our goal, like everyone else, is eventually to get paperless and like I said earlier, be modern. So trying to eliminate the paperwork flow, the burden on the driver, not only for, of course, the driver logging and the ELD, but to reduce and allow them to focus more on what they do best, I mean, their job is to drive safely, and represent our company and the public in general as well as they possibly can. So there's a lot of different apps, certainly the ELD, mapping, routing, but full workflow capability that we have where we can communicate with the driver their expectations for that workday. So we're expanding on those types of apps.
Okay, and also some vehicle maintenance elements as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now there's EDVIRs. Is a big hot topic now, so everyone's starting to take that in a mobile, and you're allowed to also do document scanning, and we can look at data in different ways, and even OS&D in different opportunities of capturing that data and transmitting it back in near real time.
Okay. Another element of the ELD mandate, of course, is the grandfather clause for existing devices that are known as AOBRDs. It's getting a little bit into the weeds, but generally we're talking about the electronic logging systems that have been on the market for a while now. In the early adopters, in Tran Service, for example, you have a choice. You can move to ELD soon, or you can wait up to 2 years beyond the December 18th implementation deadline to make the move to the full ELD specifications. Can you take us through how you are viewing that transition from AOBRD to ELD?
Sure, absolutely. We rely heavily, like everybody does, on our providers. So even though the current ELD certification is a self-certification type process, we're relying heavily on our vendors to do that and meet the guidelines as recommended. We certainly have the grandfather clause to lean back on, but as with most carriers, and certainly the early adopter group, our customers rely on us to provide them with the most up-to-date, accurate information. So the closer we get to the date, the more risk you have. There's going to be enough confusion already with the mandate, depending on who you ask. And we certainly don't want to have one of our drivers pulling into a station or having an inspection and having any question about the type of device or the certification that we have. We want it to be clean, simple, and concise, both for the inspector and for our driver, so they can both get on their way as soon as possible.
Okay, so you guys are definitely looking to move to the ELD specification sooner rather than later?
Absolutely, as soon as possible. Yes.
Okay, sounds good. And last question I'll leave you on, as much of the industry still has to make this transition, what would be your advice to the first-time adopters out there who are looking at the moving to e-logs? What should they keep in mind? What are your tips?
Sure, and there's at least two big ones that always seem to come up, and certainly the first is don't be afraid of the technology. Drivers are usually fairly resistant to it just because they haven't used it. It's something new and fresh. If they're used to using a smartphone, as we all are, or if they have an existing navigation system on their dashboard, maybe it's something they purchased themselves, they already know 60 to 80% perhaps of the system. They already know how to fill out their driver logs. Right. Now you're just combining those technologies. So it's not a big, scary, big brother where everyone's trying to bear down on you type of thing. And then the second part is really, if you're just looking for an ELD, then, and that's okay, as long as you're meeting the mandate, but really do your homework and research the providers that are out there, and make sure that you get feature-rich services that are going to be more meaningful to your business and the types of data that you're going to get back with it and what you can do with it to enhance your operations and efficiency.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for your input, Tom. It's great to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure the many folks out there who still need to go through this value the thoughts of those who have already been through it.
Yep,
so,
absolutely.
Thanks
My
again
pleasure.
for your time.
All right, welcome back. Moving on, I wanted to hit another question that came in from one of our viewers. Dane Doctor at Hub International asks, any projection on how the ELD mandate will impact freight rates? I'll go ahead and take this one. This is probably more in my area. I would say that if there is indeed a reduction in truck capacity, I think basic supply and demand would suggest that rates will increase. If you're a compliant carrier, especially if the economy picks up. I mean, to what extent that happens, of course, it seems to be $1 million question right now. But I think it's pretty much the typical effect of freight capacity, depending on if we see a 3 to 5% contraction or not. We've also gotten several questions about exemptions to the rule, so I think it would be helpful to maybe quickly review the exemptions that are out there. We've mentioned some of them, of course, the short haul exemption for
paper log books is the same with electronic logs. There's also trucks that were built before the year 2000 as an exemption. And we also mentioned the 8 days in any 30-day period. If your driver is required to keep logs for fewer than 8 days, or no more than 8 days, I should say, in any 30-day period, you're exempt. And there's also drive-away, tow-away operations where the vehicle is part of what's being delivered. Did I miss anything off that list?
No,
Joe?
you did. I just maybe one little clarification. I think just to start, like you said, with if you're currently exempt from having to fill out a logbook, like the short haul 100-mile radius, or any of the other agriculture or other exemptions, you would be exempt. And on the year 2000, we recently published a clarifying question and answer on our website to clarify that the 2000 model year refers to the engine model year.
Okay.
So for those carriers that are perhaps using glider kits or swapping engines out, that it was about the cost and the impact of applying the ELD rule to engines older than 2000.
Right.
So we have a clarifying question and answer folks can look at that can maybe help them out, because that has caused a little bit of confusion.
Right. It's good to put a finer point on that, especially because the truck model years are about a year off.
Correct.
So if you have a truck that's right in that range, that's how you can make that determination. And going back to our conversation with Tom, I think he has some good advice to those who are going to be going through this and implementing e-logs for the first time. And before we wrap up, Joe, I'd like to give you an opportunity to share any final tips you may have for the carriers out there who are looking at this, trying to figure it out and planning how they're going to get compliant over the next 4 months.
Sure, and again, I appreciate you giving me this opportunity to chat with you. I think the point I want to make here is just to kind of reemphasize a couple of things that have come up throughout the conversation and in the questions that have come up. And that is, for those that are new users or converting from the older AOBRD spec to new ones, do your homework. Talk to your vendor, and not just about their device and how it works, which, as I mentioned earlier, is really important, but also about your operation, so that you can make sure that that device can work for what you need to do if there's any other requirements that you have. So doing your homework, I think we've emphasized it probably 3 or 4 times, but I think it bears one more mention, which is preparation of your company policy, and your training programs. I don't think we can underscore that any more than we have. It is probably the real key is planning and training and working those things together. And lastly, I think I just would like to take the opportunity to mention that there's a lot of information out there. We have a lot of information, and whenever we get questions, and we start getting questions more than once, we post those questions and answers up on our website. I mentioned looking there for maybe the checklist for the questions that the carriers may want to ask during that process. So we're here to help, and anything we can do to provide more information, we're happy to do.
Okay, great. And I will squeeze one last question in here. We got one in from David. He's asking, can paper logs be used in the case of an ELD not working out on the road? I would take it in the event of a malfunction. Maybe you can quickly, for the benefit of those watching, take us through that process.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And oddly enough, one of the requirements of the ELD rule is make sure you have some paper logs.
Right.
I always get this question, how many? I was like, just keep a book in there. The rule does allow for this understanding that this may happen. So you have 8 days where, keeping in mind the 8-day period that we normally track for hours of service. So if the device malfunctions, sure, you go to paper logs for that period of time, and you just kind of work it from there. But back to your earlier question, I think it's another good opportunity to emphasize the fact that talking to your vendor about what their plans are for replacement or repair is also an important piece. But yes, absolutely, keep some logs on your vehicle, and if things go down, make some notes and start tracking it and work it from there.
So have a plan in place, 8 days, and you have 8 days to get an ELD back up and running if you have a malfunction. Well, this has been a great discussion, but I'm looking at the clock and we've run out of time, so that's going to do it for today's show. I'd like to thank FMCSA's Joe DeLorenzo for joining us in studio today. as well as Russ Elliott for participating in the Skype interview, and Tom Paduch for taking some time to chat in Nashville. We'd also like to extend special thanks to PeopleNet and Protective Insurance for sponsoring today's program. If you missed part of the show or just like to watch it again, a replay will be posted later today on our website, ttnews.com, and on liveonweb.ttnews.com. And if you want to learn more about the industry impact of ELDs, I'd encourage you to read our latest iTech supplement, which was included in the August 21st issue of Transport Topics. Or you can find those articles in the technology section of ttnews.com. Our next Live on Web program is scheduled for November 15th, when we will discuss trucking efficiency from emission regulations to electric trucks and beyond. Until then, thank you for joining us.